For years, digital asset discussions have revolved around speculative narratives, ideological debates, and tribal arguments, rather than understanding the deeper structural shift occurring in global finance. As we approach a phase where regulatory clarity, institutional standards, and real-world utility begin to converge, XRP stands positioned in a way that is fundamentally different from most assets in this space. Not because of hype or promises, but because the macro environment is finally aligning with the exact problems the XRP ledger was engineered to solve. The world is transitioning away from analog systems built for a pre-digital era, and as settlement demands grow more complex, speed, interoperability, and liquidity efficiency are no longer optional preferences. They are structural requirements. XRP is entering a period where these requirements are moving from theoretical concepts to lived necessities, and that shift changes the context in which it must be evaluated. When people discuss blockchain adoption, they often default to narrow use cases or speculative enthusiasm, but the deeper transformation is about the modernization of financial infrastructure. Central banks, payment networks, and liquidity providers are facing a reality where cross-border settlement infrastructure built decades ago cannot support the velocity of value transfer required in a tokenized economy. Regulatory frameworks are no longer being drafted in general terms, but with explicit focus on stablecoins, tokenization, institutional custody, and interoperability. These are not isolated conversations, they are interconnected components of a new financial stack. XRP's relevance stems from the fact that its design choices, neutral bridge asset functionality, low-cost transactions, deterministic settlement, and protocol-level compliance support, align with these emerging standards. This alignment is not speculative. It is observable in pilot programs, partnerships, and policy documents that increasingly emphasize settlement efficiency, liquidity optimization, and interoperability between tokenized assets. XRP does not derive its potential from capturing hype or creating artificial scarcity. It derives it from solving a long-standing friction point in global finance, the ability to move value seamlessly across jurisdictions, assets, and systems without requiring pre-funded liquidity pools. As tokenization expands, whether in government bonds, real-world assets, or stablecoins, the demand for neutral settlement layers becomes more logical. It is here that the XRP ledger demonstrates its purpose-built architecture rather than retrofitting itself to trends. Skepticism is understandable, especially when viewed through a Bitcoin-centric lens. Bitcoin advocates argue that decentralization, scarcity, and censorship resistance alone are the core values that will redefine finance. But this assumption overlooks a critical distinction between store-of-value narratives and utility-driven settlement infrastructure. The world's financial institutions do not replace systems based on ideology. They adopt technology based on operational efficiency, regulatory compatibility, and risk minimization. Settlement networks must function within compliance frameworks, integrate with traditional finance, and scale without destabilizing liquidity. The XRP ledger was engineered with these constraints in mind, which is why conversations surrounding institutional adoption often reference it when discussing cross-border payments rather than speculative assets built around ideological purity. The tension between ideological maximalism and pragmatic utility has led many observers to dismiss XRP prematurely. They analyze it through the lens of speculation or tribal competition, rather than infrastructure readiness. However, as regulatory clarity increases, the discourse is shifting from which asset has the strongest community to which network solves real settlement problems. This pivot reframes how XRP should be evaluated. Its consensus mechanism, built for efficiency rather than mining incentives, aligns with environmental, regulatory, and cost considerations. Its ledger architecture supports tokenization natively without requiring complex overlays or secondary layers. These are not theoretical advantages. They are structural features created before tokenization became an industry buzzword. It is important to recognize that financial systems rarely adopt technology impulsively. They prepare gradually, test quietly, and transition once standards are clear, infrastructure is proven. XRP's use cases are not speculative promises, They are reflected in ongoing pilots, regional payment integrations, and institutional exploration. While critics argue that adoption is slow, they overlook how conservative and risk-averse the world of settlement infrastructure is. The pace is not a sign of failure. It is evidence of the scale of the systems being retooled. It is unrealistic to assume that trillion-dollar settlement markets would migrate overnight, yet it is also unrealistic to assume they will remain unchanged as tokenized assets proliferate. The middle ground, measured transition, is precisely where XRP's design becomes relevant. Regulation, once viewed as a barrier, has evolved into a catalyst. As governments move toward formal frameworks, assets designed with institutional compliance in mind are gaining attention. Stablecoins and central bank digital currencies, often misunderstood as competition to digital assets, actually expand the need for neutral, interoperable bridges. Tokenized systems require settlement rails capable of moving between currencies, networks, and jurisdictions. That function is not filled by Bitcoin nor by networks primarily focused on retail speculation. It is filled by infrastructure designed for liquidity and interoperability. This is where the XRP ledger's role becomes clearer. Not replacing fiat, but connecting value systems efficiently. XRP's relevance in the evolving digital asset landscape is fundamentally tied to its real-world utility rather than speculation or hype, and understanding this distinction requires looking beyond the surface-level discussions that dominate most conversations about cryptocurrencies. Many observers focus on price charts, social media sentiment, or ideological comparisons between networks, but the deeper story lies in what the network was designed to accomplish and how it interacts with the broader financial system. XRP was created as a tool to solve structural inefficiencies in global finance, specifically in cross-border settlements where delays, high costs, and liquidity constraints have long plagued institutions and individuals alike. Traditional systems rely heavily on pre-funded accounts, slow reconciliation processes, and intermediaries that introduce friction at every step. In contrast, the XRP ledger operates as a bridge that can move value almost instantaneously, with deterministic settlement and extremely low transaction costs, providing an infrastructure-level solution to these systemic problems. This focus on utility becomes especially apparent when considering the growing complexity of tokenized assets, stablecoins, and multi-currency settlements. In a world where value is no longer confined to a single jurisdiction or currency, the ability to transfer assets quickly and reliably across borders without the need for redundant liquidity is no longer optional. It is a structural requirement. XRP's functionality as a neutral bridge asset allows institutions to optimize liquidity, reduce operational risk, and maintain compliance with evolving regulatory frameworks. These features are not marketing claims, they are the natural outcome of design decisions made to address real-world operational challenges, making XRP fundamentally different from assets created primarily as stores of value or ideological experiments. Skepticism is common, particularly from those who evaluate blockchain networks solely through the lens of maximalism or retail popularity. Bitcoin, for example, is often positioned as the ultimate standard for digital assets due to its scarcity, decentralization, and strong community, but these attributes do not inherently address the day-to-day operational challenges faced by financial institutions. Utility-driven networks like XRP are not competing on ideology, they are solving problems that exist in the infrastructure layer of finance. The distinction is subtle but critical. While ideological networks aim to redefine notions of money, XRP was built to function within existing systems, modernizing them rather than attempting to replace them entirely. This approach is why conversations around institutional adoption consistently include XRP when discussing cross-border payments, liquidity optimization, and settlement efficiency. Moreover, real-world adoption is rarely instantaneous, and XRP's measured integration into financial systems reflects this reality. Large institutions operate under constraints of regulatory compliance, operational risk, and internal approval processes, which means that the pace of adoption is deliberate rather than reactive. Pilots, partnerships, and ongoing testing programs may not always be publicized, but they are indicative of the network's functional readiness. XRP's utility is demonstrated in these practical applications. It reduces the need for pre-funded accounts, accelerates settlement times, and provides transparent and traceable liquidity flows. The network is not dependent on speculative interest for its relevance. Its value is realized when ESC functional benefits are implemented in live systems. Finally, the market frequently underestimates utility-driven networks because it conflates popularity with relevance. Price is often seen as the primary indicator of success, but in reality, it is a lagging consequence of adoption and practical utility. XRP's value emerges when financial systems recognize the efficiency gains, liquidity optimization, and interoperability it offers, not because of social media hype or short-term speculative trends. Understanding this requires shifting perspective from immediate market sentiment to structural evolution. XRP's relevance is a reflection of its ability to meet real-world financial needs, a capability that becomes increasingly clear as regulatory frameworks solidify and tokenized assets proliferate. Recognizing this is essential to understanding why XRP is approaching a phase where its true value will be acknowledged, not through speculation, but through practical implementation and sustained utility. Emerging regulatory clarity, the rise of stablecoins, and the ongoing tokenization of assets are often perceived as challenges or barriers to digital asset adoption. But for XRP, they act as catalysts that highlight its inherent strengths. Understanding this requires stepping back from superficial narratives and examining how financial systems adapt to evolving standards. For decades, global finance has relied on legacy infrastructure designed for a pre-digital world. Settlement networks were built to handle predictable, slow-moving flows of value and to operate within well-defined regulatory frameworks. However, the rise of tokenized assets, including stablecoins, digital bonds, and other programmable financial instruments, is changing these assumptions. Financial institutions now face operational pressures to move value faster, more efficiently, and across the asset classes, often in ways that existing systems cannot accommodate without significant friction. In this context, regulatory clarity does not represent a limitation. It defines the boundaries within which efficient, compliant systems must operate, and XRP was designed precisely to function within these boundaries. Stablecoins, in particular, have become a focus for regulators worldwide because they straddle the line between traditional fiat currency and digital assets. While critics sometimes view stablecoins as competitors to digital assets like XRP, the reality is that they create complementary demand for networks capable of seamless settlement. When multiple stablecoins exist across different jurisdictions, financial institutions require reliable, neutral rails to transfer liquidity efficiently between them. XRP's function as a bridge asset allows it to connect disparate systems, reducing the need for pre-funded accounts and minimizing settlement delays. This capability becomes increasingly critical as the volume of tokenized transactions grows and as compliance frameworks demand transparency, traceability, and auditability in these movements of value. In essence, regulation and the proliferation of stablecoins define the problem space, and XRP's design provides the practical solution. Tokenization extends beyond stablecoins to include digital representations of traditional assets such as equities, bonds, and commodities. As tokenized assets gain traction, the infrastructure required to move them safely and efficiently must be interoperable, scalable, and compliant with global standards. Networks built primarily for speculation or ideological purposes often struggle to meet these requirements, but the XRP ledger was engineered with these constraints in mind. Its deterministic settlement mechanism, low transaction cost, and built-in compliance features make it suitable for institutions that need predictable, auditable, and rapid liquidity transfer. The combination of regulatory alignment and technological readiness positions XRP to act as a practical tool for financial modernization rather than a speculative instrument waiting for narrative-driven adoption. Skeptics may argue that regulatory scrutiny slows adoption, but this perspective misses the broader context. Financial institutions are inherently risk-averse, and regulatory clarity actually accelerates meaningful adoption because it reduces uncertainty. Networks that are designed with compliance in mind, like XRP, are better positioned to integrate with traditional finance than networks that prioritize decentralization or ideology at the expense of operational efficiency. The convergence of regulation, tokenization, and stablecoins is therefore not a hurdle. It is a filter that distinguishes networks capable of long-term utility from those relying on speculative momentum. XRP's alignment with these factors explains why discussions about cross-border payments, liquidity optimization, and institutional experimentation consistently reference it as a solution-ready infrastructure. Finally, it is crucial to recognize that price is a secondary consequence of adoption, not a leading indicator. Regulatory frameworks, tokenization initiatives, and stablecoin growth define the environment in which practical utility is realized. XRP's relevance increases as these factors mature because the network addresses problems that the old infrastructure cannot solve efficiently. Early understanding of this alignment allows observers to see value before the broader market reacts. The combination of regulatory clarity, stablecoin proliferation, and tokenized asset adoption does not create hype. It highlights structural necessity. XRP's role as a compliant, efficient, and neutral settlement layer demonstrates that utility, not speculation, drives long-term relevance in a rapidly evolving financial ecosystem. Financial institutions operate within a framework that prioritizes operational efficiency, regulatory compliance, and risk management, and their adoption of technology is guided not by ideology but by functionality. XRP Ledger's architecture aligns with these priorities, making institutional adoption a natural consequence of readiness rather than a speculative phenomenon. Understanding this dynamic requires a closer look at how institutions evaluate new systems and why networks designed for utility gain traction over those built primarily for ideological or speculative purposes. Unlike retail markets, where sentiment and hype can drive short-term engagement, institutional adoption is deliberate, structured, and governed by layers of oversight. Banks, payment providers, and global liquidity networks do not experiment with technology casually. They pilot programs, conduct risk assessments, and evaluate regulatory compatibility before integrating any system at scale. XRP's design, optimized for predictable settlement times, low transaction costs, and cross-asset interoperability, matches these criteria, positioning it as a network ready for practical implementation. The XRP ledger was intentionally built to solve specific operational challenges faced by institutions. Traditional cross-border settlement systems are often slow, expensive, and dependent on pre-funded accounts, creating liquidity inefficiencies and operational bottlenecks. XRP's functionality as a bridge asset addresses these issues by enabling instantaneous settlement and reducing the need for redundant capital allocation across jurisdictions. Institutions can move value between currencies, stablecoins, and tokenized assets without maintaining large balances in multiple locations, a capability that significantly lowers operational risk and improves capital efficiency. These are measurable, practical benefits, not speculative promises, which explains why discussions of institutional pilots and partnership programs consistently include XRP. The network's readiness for institutional adoption is therefore rooted in its ability to solve problems that legacy systems cannot, rather than in narrative-driven popularity. Another important factor is the conservative nature of institutional decision-making. Large financial entities are subject to internal compliance standards, regulatory oversight, and fiduciary responsibilities, meaning adoption occurs gradually and cautiously. Pilots and integration programs may take months or even years to move from testing to full-scale deployment, but this measured pace reflects the scale and risk sensitivity of the systems involved. XRP's relevance in this context is often underestimated by observers who expect rapid adoption or sensational announcements. The network's utility is demonstrated quietly through operational efficiency gains, liquidity optimization, and system integration, rather than through hype or social media metrics. This gradual adoption cycle is a feature, not a limitation, and it reinforces the idea that institutional adoption is fundamentally different from retail speculation. Institutional adoption also highlights the importance of compliance and interoperability. Regulatory requirements are no longer peripheral considerations. They are central to how banks and financial institutions evaluate digital asset networks. XRP's built-in compliance features, predictable transaction finality, and support for multi-asset settlements allow it to integrate with existing financial infrastructure without creating undue regulatory exposure. This alignment between technical design and regulatory expectation accelerates adoption because it mitigates risk and ensures that operational improvements are both measurable and defensible. Networks that fail to meet these criteria often remain confined to niche or retail-focused use cases, whereas XRP's utility-driven architecture positions it for broad institutional relevance. Finally, price is not the driver of adoption. It is the consequence of recognized utility. Observers often misinterpret slow market movement as a lack of relevance, but in institutional contexts, adoption is confirmed through operational integration rather than social signals. When systems demonstrate measurable benefits, improved settlement speed, reduced liquidity costs, and predictable transaction behavior, the practical value becomes evident and market perception follows. XRP's alignment with institutional priorities explains why it continues to be evaluated seriously by banks, payment providers, and liquidity networks. Understanding this perspective requires separating ideological narratives from operational realities and recognizing that institutions reward readiness, utility, and compliance long before the broader market internalizes these factors. Adoption is therefore not a question of hype but of structural capability, and XRP's design ensures it is positioned precisely where institutional systems require it most. Market perception often lags behind structural utility, and this principle is especially true in the case of XRP. Price is frequently treated as the primary indicator of value in digital assets, yet in reality it is a consequence of understanding and adoption rather than a predictor. The financial systems and networks that shape real-world value are slow-moving by design, built to prioritize security, compliance, and operational efficiency over rapid speculation or hype-driven behavior. As a result, networks that provide measurable utility, like XRP, are often underappreciated in the early stages because their impact is structural rather than immediately visible. Most people recognize value only after infrastructure has proven itself, standards have been established, and institutional integration has reached a level where efficiency gains are evident. This delay in recognition is not a flaw. It is a natural feature of systems that operate at scale, and it explains why XRP's true potential may appear underestimated in the public narrative. The concept of early understanding versus late recognition is central to interpreting XRP's long-term relevance. History shows that technological or infrastructural innovations are rarely appreciated at the moment of creation. Investors and observers often focus on superficial metrics, such as price movements or market sentiment, without fully grasping the structural problem the technology addresses. XRP's ledger was designed to solve inefficiencies in cross-border settlements, optimize liquidity, and facilitate interoperability between tokenized and fiat assets. These solutions are measurable and practical, but their value is only fully recognized when they are adopted and tested at scale. The disconnect between early utility and public perception is common in financial systems because operational improvements are often implemented quietly and gradually, with measurable outcomes becoming visible only after months or years of integration. Understanding XRP through the lens of early recognition requires appreciating the way systems reward foresight, Networks that solve fundamental problems are ultimately recognized for their contributions, but this recognition follows observable adoption and integration rather than speculation or narrative popularity. XRP's relevance increases as tokenized assets proliferate, stablecoins gain regulatory clarity, and financial institutions integrate modernized settlement rails. By the time mainstream awareness catches up, the network has already demonstrated measurable impact through operational efficiency, liquidity reduction, and cross-border interoperability. Those who understand the underlying utility early are positioned to recognize value before it is widely acknowledged, highlighting the difference between informed observation and reactive speculation. Moreover, this principle explains why debates focus solely on price or ideology often miss the most critical aspects of XRP's trajectory. Market hype, social media trends, and ideological narratives are transient. They influence short-term behavior but do not change the structural realities that drive adoption and utility. XRP's ledger operates independently of these narratives, and its relevance is determined by its ability to integrate with existing financial infrastructure, support regulatory compliance, and provide measurable operational improvements. Price may eventually reflect these factors, but it is a lagging indicator. The systems themselves, through adoption and efficiency, confirm value long before speculative sentiment aligns. Finally, a long-term perspective underscores the advantage of early understanding. Most people recognize value only after integration is proven, policies are clarified, and efficiency gains are realized. Systems reward those who identify utility early because they can anticipate structural shifts rather than reacting to transient market signals. XRP exemplifies this dynamic. Its ledger's design, operational readiness, and alignment with institutional priorities create a foundation for lasting relevance. Recognizing this requires separating price and narrative from practical functionality and observing adoption and system integration as the true measures of value. By understanding this, it becomes clear why XRP's potential is approaching a phase where recognition will follow adoption, not the other way around, and why early comprehension of structural utility provides a distinct perspective that is often overlooked by the broader market.